So recently I've had a couple of requests through this channel and other groups that I'm a part of about researching veterans, particularly from the Second World War. So what I thought I would do is kind of condense all of the tips that I've picked up over the last couple of years doing this into this video in the hope that I can link to it in the future and get people kind of started on the journey, because I think it's one of the most thrilling things to find the name of someone that you know or you're researching in documents and find out a little bit more about what they did during the war. So first of all, most of my experience is about the RAF, but this will also apply to people that are looking into the United States Army Air Forces, the Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African Air Forces as well. Although I have to admit that the South African Air Force is a little bit tricky because I don't believe they kept records before the 60s. But we'll talk about that as we go through. So I'm going to put all this into a web page and hopefully have loads of links that you can go to. But just know that the basic principles I'm going through will kind of work with all the other air forces. It's just some of the databases or records you'll be looking at are in other places. So the most useful thing you can get is the service record for the person that you're researching. Now, in order to get that, particularly for the RAF, you're just going to need their full name, their date of birth, and their service number. Now, the last two, if you don't know them, I'm going to talk about how you might find out this information a little bit later in the video. But by giving these three bits of information, you're going to get the service record fairly easily and fairly quickly. So at the moment, they're saying it could take up to a year to get these. I found that so during the summer, I did a video about a bomber crew, and I think I put the request in around June for two guys, and the first one came back in November and the second one came back in December. Unfortunately, they didn't come back in time for me to use it in the video. Recently, I'm doing another video on another chap, and I put the request in May, and it came through the next month. So it's taking anywhere between a month and 12 months at the moment. So the RAF records, for the most part, are still with the RAF, at least with the Ministry of Defence. So you need to put a request in there. Now, it is free, but there are some conditions, and you may not get the full records back. A lot of information might be redacted, but for the most part, it's just going to be medical information and any disciplinary information there. But there's still loads of information that you can use in order to sort of further your research about the individual. So the only criteria you really need to be aware of is whether or not the individual you're researching died in service or died in combat. If they did, then you don't need to provide any more documentation. Also, if the individual was born more than 116 years ago, you don't need to provide any extra documentation. Now, if you're researching someone who fought in the Second World War, they're unlikely to have been born over 116 years ago. In this case, you need to provide a digital copy of their death certificate. Now, this is not too difficult to get hold of. There is a fee attached to it, but it's not going to break the bank. And there is actually details about this on the website that I'll link to in the webpage that I'm going to create about this. So I had a quick look for the other air forces of the Allies, and for the most part, it's a pretty similar situation. With the US forms, you have to provide service numbers, names, social security numbers if you know them, just as much information as you can to narrow down the search and get that information back quicker. So one of the exchanges that kind of kicked off the idea for this video was with a guy on a Facebook group who just really had a name for his, I think it was his great uncle, or perhaps his uncle, I can't remember now. He just had his name and a story about how he was the only one to have survived a crash. And I love these kind of little research projects. He didn't have the guy's service number. So what do you do if you're trying to get this information from the MOD and you don't have the service number? So the best way to start is actually with one of the genealogy websites. So something like Ancestry or Find My Past, particularly Find My Past because they partnered up with the National Archive, so a lot of the information is actually on there. Now, these are paid services. Often you can get a trial. I'm not sure if they're running trials at the moment, but even if you just have to pay for 1 month, just a basic subscription level, you can find all the information you want and then just cancel it before you have to pay for another month. And it's worth it if you want to get the information. So I found that you can often find the service number pretty quickly with these sites because they're listed with the London Gazette. So if you're talking about an officer in particular, whenever they're promoted, you're normally going to find their service number alongside that announcement in the London Gazette. And then obviously you can send that on to the MOD and get their service record with that. Another reason I would suggest the genealogy websites is often when you're researching someone with a common name, my granddad, for example, John Wright, there's so many John Wrights out there, you're really going to need to narrow down that search to the right person. And with the internet age today, you might find on these genealogy websites that someone has already started to sort of do a family tree that involves the person that you're researching, and that can really cut down your research time, get the right name, the right details that then you can pass on to the MOD and get the right service record. Also, if the person you're researching was not an officer, that information is still held with the RAF. If they're aircrew, they're probably a flight sergeant or sergeant, and that information is still with the RAF. So you still need to go through that process with the MOD to get that service record. Okay, so once you do get that information back and you have the service record on your screen, it's going to give you a lot of really cool information, particularly the squadrons where the individual served. Now it's going to start off, particularly if they're a pilot with their flight schools, or if they're another trade in the aircrew, it will tell you details of where they start their training. Then you're going to have some sort of OTU, the operational training unit. And then it will tell you the operational squadrons where they served. Now, the great thing, because we are living in an age of excellent online research, you're going to find that the information for those operational squadrons is free and available and all digitized and ready to download from your browser. This information is held with the National Archive for the RAF, and with other air services you'll find similar information out there like that. So this is when you turn to the National Archives or the Public Record Office in Kew. Now you can go there in person, and if you have the opportunity, I really would recommend it. I went there when I was back in the UK last, and it's really thrilling. I can't really think of a better word than that. I love the fact that you can go and actually handle documents that are 80 years old and find names of people that you know or know of in those records. It's quite undescribable if you haven't done it before. Now, obviously, that's not going to be possible for everyone. Even for me, it took me like an hour and a half to get across London to go there. It's not that convenient unless you're living right there in Kew. Thankfully, their website is really good, and a lot of the information is there and you can download it, especially with the operational squadrons. So these are held, there's different references or dossiers where the information is held. Now, for the operational record books, which is where the information is that we want, these are held in the file called Air27. So when you go onto the website, you'll find a search here, and you want to click on the advanced search feature. Now, what I found is the quickest way to go about this is to put in the squadron in the field that says exact word or phrase. So for example, 83 squadron, let's say, and then you put the references here, Air 27. And I find you don't need a gap there. And this will give you the complete series of the operational record books. If you want to narrow it down to a particular date, you can do the year. And what you're looking for here are two particular records. So there's one called the summary of events, and there's one called the record of events. So in one of them, you're going to get sort of the missions that were flown, any details of that day to day. And the other one lists the aircraft that were flown and the crews associated with those aircraft. And that's the really cool part, where you start seeing the name of the person you're researching come up in those records. I can't get over that. It's really cool. So at the time of recording, if you sign up to the National Archives and have an account there, which you can do for free, you can download these records at no fee at all. Now, it's weird because unless you sign in, it's telling you it's £3.50 for each of the records, but as soon as you sign in, it's free. I don't know how long that's going to last for. Hopefully they don't change it back and start charging us for this information, because well, obviously it's nice not having to pay for it, especially for me, because I use this as quite often. There's actually you can download 100 of these records a month, and I've gone over that on some months sometimes. There are also some other references that you might want to look up, particularly if you're talking about someone who was in Fighter Command. If you look in Air 50 and you put the squadron name or the name of the individual, you might actually come up with a combat report. And this is really interesting, obviously, because it tells you what they were doing on that particular mission, and you know, who they shot down, or who they think they shot down at least. There are some other records that you can look at as well, but for the most part, you're going to have to go to the Public Records Office at Kew to get this information. So information about prisoners of war, or whether they were wounded, casualties, and other references of that nature. So just backtracking a little bit to the operational record books, you do get the digitized versions of the operational squadrons. However, a lot of the OTUs, they're not available to download. You're going to have to go to the actual records for this. I've been quite lucky. I'm going to talk about Facebook groups a little bit later in the video, but there are some where I've been able to request copies that other people have made when they went to the records office. But I've got to warn you, for the most part, if you're trying to get information about a trainee in these organisations, names don't come up that often. You're not going to get a full report on an individual. However, if the person you're researching was an instructor or something like that, you might find information about them through those operational record books. Also, if you're just interested in what kind of training the person you're researching went through, it's worth paying a visit to the records office for that. Or, as I said, I'll talk about the Facebook groups later on, seeing if anyone had a copy of that particular OTU's ORB. But again, don't hold your breath. There's not always that much information for researchers like you and I. So those are the primary sources for the RAF, and it's really great that we're able to just download them from our browser at home. Some of the secondary resources are also pretty good. If you're researching someone who was unfortunately killed in action, by far the best resource online at the moment is the International Bomber Command Centre's website. I think they're funded by the National Lottery now, so they've got a bit of money behind them, and you can really tell the level of research they've gone to. So if you go onto their search function, I think it's search the war dead. I'll put a link in all the description and on the webpage later. You put your name in, as much information as you can, and it will tell you about their last mission. And it's going to tell you the aircraft they were flying in, if it's known, some of the circumstances of how they lost their life, and also links back to the ORBs and any other information there. So this is a really useful resource, and it tells you a lot. I've used that website a lot. Another pretty good one is the rfcommands.com website. Again, this is more sort of a reference website. It links out to a lot of other information that's out there on the net. I've also found a lot of information through this one. And also another kind of like a genealogy website, I suppose, is I think it's newspapers.com. I'll make sure I put it up on screen because I'm not sure if it's newspaper or newspapers.com. I found this quite useful because you can put in the name of the person you're researching, and sometimes you come up with stories and even pictures I found, which is quite exciting, especially if you've never seen the person's face before. So it really depends. Sometimes you don't get the big national papers, you get more regional papers. But again, a good resource, worth paying the subscription for a month if you're just searching for an individual. So this kind of brings me on to some of my ninja tips, I would say. So I would call myself a content creator. I've built websites and YouTube channels for the last 5 or 6 years. And we do kind of have a golden age of search, but you may not be aware that Google they're kind of throwing a spanner in the works. They're obviously the largest search engine, but you don't always get the best results. But what you can do is to refine your search results. Now, when I was trying to help the guy out who just had a name and a backstory, I I was able to use some of these refined research techniques to actually get the service number. That wasn't that easy to find. So when you're on Google, if you put in, for example, I was researching Derek J. Fielder. It was one of the guys from the video I made before last year. If I was just to put that search term in, as it were, you'd get all sorts of things, loads of web pages. But if you put in Derek J. Fielder with speech marks around it, it's only going to return those web pages with that exact phrase in it, which obviously cuts down on what you're looking at. When you find there's a website that you want to get information out of, for example, I did a video recently about the Battle of Britain Memorial flight Spitfire that unfortunately crashed, and I wanted to understand a bit of information about its history and who flew it during the war. And I came across a nice little website all about that particular squadron. Now, if you put in to your search bar site:/ and then the name of the website, for example, rafcommands.com, or in this case, I think it was 443squadron.com, something like that. Then you put in your search term in quote marks, so Derek J. Fielder, or the name of the surname or whatever. It's only going to return the results for that particular search term from that particular website. And in that case, I was able to get very quickly the results I wanted for that research term. So in that way, if you don't have a lot of information about the person you're researching, that's a really quick way to find out if that information exists online. Okay, so even if you're able to get the service records and you get the ORBs for that particular squadron or the squadrons that you're interested in, you've still not really got the meat on the bones. So in this case, my recommendation would be to turn to Facebook. Now, there are lots and lots of really great Facebook groups of people that are very passionate about this topic. And while they're very useful for this, they can also be very difficult. So as a YouTuber about the Second World War, these guys, they terrify me because they will pick up anything you get wrong, which is why I do as much research as I can, not to look like a total idiot, or idiot as someone called me recently online. But as I said, they're very passionate about this topic, and some of them are total sweethearts, and they really are willing to go above and beyond to get you the information that you want. So I would recommend, firstly, look for the Facebook groups which have the most people in them. Obviously, the more eyes you can get on your question, the more information you're likely to get. For Bomber Command, I would certainly recommend the Bomber Command Interest Group, I think it's called now. It was recently renamed. Again, I will link all this on the webpage when I create it, and ask your questions there, and you're more than likely to get really good information about particular missions or squadrons or any, research tips really. There are a couple good RAF Fighter Command Facebook groups. If you're looking at particular periods, for example, the Battle of Britain, then Paul Davis does some pretty good information there, and you can contact him, and I'm sure he seems a pretty passionate guy about that particular period. You might get a good response there. But these communities is really a great way to put the flesh on the bones if you're looking to get more information about exactly what the person you were researching was doing at the time in question. Also, talking about Facebook is groups about logbooks. So you may or may not be lucky enough to have the logbook of the person you're researching. I know that many relatives that have the logbooks will never let them go. Unfortunately, some of them over time have been lost, stolen, whatever. So you may be lucky enough to actually find a person who owns the logbook of the person you're researching. To be honest, it's a small chance, but it's worth asking. I know that in the 50s or 60s, I think the National Archive, they destroyed a lot of logbooks that weren't claimed, didn't want to store them, and obviously that's a crying shame for the information that was lost. But you never know. You can ask, and you might be lucky to get at least some information. It's maybe unlikely the person will give it back to you, but you never know. So in addition to asking people in Facebook groups to kind of flesh out this story a little bit, there are some great secondary sources. So I would really recommend, for a general idea of what the RAF were doing, to look for the Bomber Command. There's the Bomber Command War Diaries by Middlebrook and Everett. Really good book for sort of a day-to-day idea of what was happening. But also Barry Hope has written a lot of books about individual squadrons, which really puts a lot of good information into your hands. I think at the moment you can only get the books directly from him. He's got a Facebook group as well. And I think the books are something like 25 quid at the highest, something like that. I think 14, 15 quid, 25 quid, something like that. So you can look him up and buy them directly from him. Also, there's a lot of other series of books about particular squadrons. And quite often I found that you get the information that you want and just a good general idea of what was happening and what the men were going through at the time. So as I said, this was really to condense all that information into one place that I could link to try and help people just get started with their research, because there's so much you can find out and it can go as deep as you want. But so let me know. I'm going to write this all up in a web page. And if there's anything I've missed or anything that wasn't 100% clear, let me know and I'll try and clarify that in the write-up and add to that page as we go along. And just good luck. Hopefully you find what you're looking for. And as I said, it's totally thrilling to find those names in those records. And if you get a chance, go to the Public Records Office, because there's so much more information that's not available online. And it's really going to flesh out the story. And you never know, you know, you can pass this on to the next generations, might even write yourself a book or something. And I think it's worth your time. It's worth a little bit of investment of money to, you know, sign up to those genealogy websites and all that sort of thing. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you found it useful. If you did, please share the video, subscribe to the channel, give me a like, and see you in another video in the future.